In this video, I want to explain why frame walls insulated with fiber-based insulation are so bad in basements. So what you've got in front of you here now is this is the masonry wall of your house. So this is the foundation wall. And over in here, it's the inside basement space. This is a side view of a stud frame wall. It could be metal or wood. It doesn't really matter. In both of those cases, we need to have a plastic vapor barrier on the inside here, on the warm face. And the reason for that is because if we didn't, warm indoor air, like you see here, in my example, it's 72 degrees Fahrenheit with a relative humidity of 50%. If that air were not prevented from entering the wall cavity, and that's the job of the vapor barrier, by the way, to prevent that infiltration. But we need to have a vapor barrier there because if the indoor air in your basement were allowed to get into the insulation during wintertime or any time when it's cool outside, you could, in fact probably would, have some condensation developing right inside the wall cavity. So let me give you an example. Let's say outside here it's cold and the inside surface of your masonry wall with the insulation in place has dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not unusual, especially as you start getting up closer to the top of the wall where there's less soil on the outside of your house to ameliorate the temperatures. So if this indoor air were allowed to penetrate through, if there was no vapor barrier plastic here, then eventually the temperature of that air would drop to what's called dew point. In this case, the dew point of air at 72 degrees Fahrenheit with 50% relative humidity, the dew point is 52 degrees Fahrenheit. So if that air that's inside your basement cools to that point, the relative humidity will rise to 100%. Which means that there's going to be condensation forming. So we solve that problem in a basement, or at least traditional builders, I'll say, solve this problem in a basement with a vapor barrier exactly the same way as the problem is solved for above ground walls. And that's fine. The plastic, if it's applied properly, will stop the infiltration, will stop the formation of condensation. However, the basement environment is different, and we're faced with a kind of catch-22 situation, because on the one hand, we need the vapor barrier on the inside, but we've got this problem. We've got the very real possibility of moisture migration into the basement, because outside there's soil, and that soil gets rain on it, and the soil gets moist lots of times, and masonry is not a particularly waterproof material, even when it doesn't have any cracks. So there's a distinct possibility that we're going to have moisture, either liquid or vapor, moving into the wall frame. And the problem with the vapor barrier here is that it seals it in, so it won't be able to get out. And that's why frame walls are so vulnerable to moisture, and that's why I don't recommend them for basements, because if we get any kind of moisture, liquid or vapor, into the wall cavity, mold will grow. It's as simple as that. Now you might be thinking, well, couldn't we just put another vapor barrier on the outside of the wall? Wouldn't that solve the problem? And I guess in theory it would, but the problem is theory doesn't always align with practice. And what you'd find is that no matter how hard you try, you're never going to be able to apply a completely waterproof layer on the outside of this wall. For instance, let's say we do put the plastic there. We're very diligent about that. But what about down here? What about if a little bit of moisture, even liquid moisture, builds up in here? It's going to wet the wood. And wood is porous, and it's going to soak up some of that water. Eventually the moisture is going to come into the wall from this direction. And even if you wrapped this and sealed it, there's going to be a hole somewhere. There's going to be joints that overlap. The thing about water is that a lot of liquid water can get into a very small opening. Even a pinhole can admit a lot of liquid water. But for that water to escape, it has to escape in the form of water vapor. It has to dry out, in other words. How much drying is going to occur through a pinhole-sized hole? I mean, the liquid water came in, maybe even in fairly large quantities, but it's not going to get out again. It's almost like it's a one-way deal. So all of this adds up, in my mind, and after a lot of experience in seeing different wall situations, to recommend against this, even though I would say most basements that are being finished right now are being finished with this kind of a wall on the outer perimeter of the basement, and that's a problem, because it's essentially a moisture trap and with organic material in there. Even if you frame your wall with metal studs, which are not organic, mold and mildew can still grow on any fiber insulation that I've seen, given enough moisture and enough time. So why bother when we have alternatives that work very well? They actually go up faster, they insulate better, and they won't leave you vulnerable like a frame wall will.